Welcome to the Geekery in General podcast. My name is Al, and today I've got a friend of mine joining me today to discuss game design. If you've been listening to Creepypasta Theater, you will recognize her voice, and she also was on A Strange and Interesting. My friend Tracy Nicholas. How are you doing today, Tracy?
Great. Thank you for asking. How are you?
Oh, not too bad. Well, the holiday season is in full swing, and maybe you or a friend or a family member is interested in puzzles. That is what Tracy is going to talk about with us today. She is a game designer, and her company is called Madmen and Heroes, where she specializes in, I believe you described it as escape room type puzzle boxes.
That's right. Yes. So basically what the model is it is a subscription box that I mail out. Each of my storylines goes out once a month. And when you get the box, it has puzzles and ciphers and different parts of the story. And what you have to do is you go through and you start by figuring out what you have to do, where you start. There's an introductory letter that introduces the story. And then you see if you can solve anything, or you see if there's a website that you can go to, and you explore a little bit. And then you're just like an escape room, you're off to the races.
So we'll discuss more about your different products that you make, but let's start with a little bit of introduction. So let's go back to when you were a child. Were there any sort of games that you usually liked playing, whether they were board games or card games or any other type of games?
Well, the usual board games, of course. And I did for a while, this is sort of a different path, but I was very into cribbage. I loved cribbage, and I was in a league, and we would play, and that's the earliest that I can remember of picking something other than games that my parents bought.
Yeah, that's actually something. I don't think I've ever actually played it, but you're not alone. I mean, my friend Chad, who used to podcast with me, him and his wife actually used to do the cribbage leagues as well. So I was not aware that there's actually leagues for that game.
Well, it was within my school.
Oh, okay.
And so it would be there was a free period, because I mean it must have started in fifth grade playing. And so it's just, a bunch of my classmates that we formed our own league to play on our, free time, probably for me to get out of having to go run around on the playground, because I was not an athletic child.
Yeah. And then, so in addition to cribbage, were there any board games or card games that you also enjoyed playing?
Well, I did dip briefly into Dungeons and Dragons before it was cool. But that was mostly because my big brother was really into it, and I really looked up to him, and I wanted to spend time with him.
Yeah, in my case, when I first started getting introduced to Dungeons and Dragons, for me, it was my older cousin, and then we also had some older family friends who played the game, and it's like, or some older family friends who had kids who are older than me who played the game. And I remember back then, it's like I would watch them play the game, and even though I wasn't really understanding what was going on, it was still interesting and a lot of fun to watch, but eventually got into it, and things kind of went from there.
Yeah, and I mean, my dad taught me card games, like we would play poker or, gin rummy. And so that was always a lot of fun. And by the time it got to the 80s, definitely Trivial Pursuit was a big family favorite.
Oh, yeah. That was another one of my fond memories from when I was a kid playing board games. And if you've ever gone way, 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 way back in my catalog of episodes, my first one, my original co-host, Steve, we've known each other since we were like 4 years old, and we actually did an entire episode about some of the board games we used to play back when we were kids. It's definitely interesting how board games have changed over the years.
Well, it is very interesting, because when I was doing my research when I was first starting up my company, I was looking at different kinds of games and things like that. And I just, went down so many rabbit holes, so many rabbit holes. And what I found out, and of course, the perennial childhood favorite of Monopoly, that was originally designed by a woman. It was called the Landlord's Game. And it was meant to demonstrate to people how the system that we have for like landlords and renting, how detrimental it is to the people who are on the renting side. So it was like intended originally to be a cautionary tale against capitalism and the way that our, capitalist system works, because basically the theory behind it is that the landlord isn't adding value. It's like a financial theory about how we produce value in order to keep the economy going, and how it's bad for the economy. So, and then they turned it into a, fun-filled children's game.
And it's a good point. Some of the games that we used to play as kids, there's like all these different versions. And I mean, you mentioned Monopoly as an example, and there's like I mean, I don't know if they've got any down by your area, but where I live, they have like the Fox Valley version of it, where instead of like the normal properties, they have local ones. And I've seen ones for other cities like Milwaukee and Madison, and I'm sure there's other cities that have the same thing.
There's a Chicago one. There's an Evanston one, which is the town I live in. And then there's so many specialty versions of it. You can find it for any interest.
Yeah, like I've seen like Lord of the Rings Monopoly, Star Wars Monopoly, Simpsons Monopoly. So they've certainly got the capitalism nailed down there with catering to the variety of audiences.
Right. Yeah. Well, and you think of some of those games that we played, like, Operation. Like, that's pretty gruesome. What are they thinking with those games when we were young? But we loved them, right?
That's true. And you're right. There's certain things that we don't think about, and also just the complexity and the amount of setup that some of them involve. Like, of course, as kids, we remember playing games like Chutes and Ladders and Candyland, where you open the board, you choose your colored piece, roll the die, and you're just basically going around the board. And it's like, now there's games that like sometimes it takes longer to set up than to actually play the game. And like, what a good example, my friend Steve that I mentioned, both of us are fans of the sci-fi series Firefly.
I was just going to bring this up because I have the Firefly game. And it is so complex that I've never actually gotten to play it.
Yeah, we actually have it too, and I have a couple of the expansions as well. And we did, like, the first time we played it, it took like 3 hours between like setup and actually playing the game. And we were just actually doing the basic, the intro adventure. So yeah, it's one of those games. If I had more time, I'd love to play it again, but it's like, it's not like some of the older games where it's just like, hey, you want to come over for 30, 45 minutes and play a board game? It's like, okay, is your afternoon free?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I bought it originally. I had a group of my friends from high school a few years back decided that we wanted to rewatch the series. And so we started gathering every week or so, maybe not quite that frequently, but at somebody's house, and we would watch an episode. And then we'd just hang out and be social. But this is also a group of friends they're casual, very casual gamers, but they like a board game night. So I thought, buy this, it'll be great. Well, they came and we start looking at it, and like at a certain point, someone's like, let's play Cards Against Humanity.
Oh, and then things just kind of devolved from there.
Exactly. And that's just kind of the way that it goes with that group. I think that there was just enough wine at that point where everyone's like, we don't want to start the game now.
So since you mentioned watching Firefly, do you have like a favorite episode of that show?
I don't know that I could pick a favorite episode, but there's a couple of quotes that I really like. I like Captain Dummy Speak, and the one about, I swear on my pretty floral bonnet. So yeah, but it's, I mean, it's just all so good. How can you pick one?
Yeah, that's true. It's like that was one of those shows that I don't think we'll ever see an equal to it in that, it had that perfect blend of humor and action and adventure. And I'd have to say my favorite episodes, they're the back-to-back ones, Shing Ding and Safe,
Okay.
where one of my favorite quotes in there, in Shing Ding, Mal is, he's getting in a sword fight with a guy and he finally beats him using kind of underhanded means. And he's like, mercy is the hallmark of a great man, stabs the guy. I'm just a good man. Stabs him again. Okay, I'm not that bad.
That's really funny. The actor who played Mal, he went on. I can't remember what the name of his next show was, but he played. Was it a reporter?
Yeah, Castle.
Castle. Yeah. So part of that show is that is like with the relationship with his kid, and in a Halloween episode, he comes out wearing the Captain Mal outfit, and she looks at him and she looks him up and down and she goes, didn't you wear that like 5 years ago?
A friend of mine watched that show, and there's also another little nod to Firefly in that. His character said something in Nathan Fillion. His character said something in Chinese, and someone asked him, "Did you study abroad?" He's like, "Nah, TV show I used to watch."
That's great.
So before we get too much into Firefly, again, may it
Yes.
rest in peace. So let's get back to getting back to the topic here. How did you first get interested in game design?
Well, I had gotten a promotion at work and I was a strategic planner for a large organization. And I got this promotion and I thought, oh, I want to give myself a treat for, getting promoted. And so I bought one of these games. And this was back in maybe 2015. And I played it with a good friend of mine. And we got into it and we're trying to figure it out. And by the time it was much pricier than what my boxes are, and it was over $100. And I got through the whole thing, and I was like, we must have missed something. Like that can't be it, because essentially there were a few puzzles, maybe two maybe, but it was a lot of reading. And so there was a journal that you read, and it just told the story. And so we eventually emailed the company and said, what did we miss? And they're like, no, that was it. And so it put that in the back of my mind. And when I decided that I was sick of corporate life and I didn't want to do that anymore, I thought back to the games and I thought, I could do better. And so I just dove in and I started researching different kinds of puzzles and different kinds of games, and just started looking around for stories and started developing the first storyline, which is called The Resistance, and just figured it out, really.
So you mentioned you'd had the pleasure of working with corporate America, and this kind of lackluster experience with a game inspired you to do your own. Now, back when we did our episode on stage combat, we talked in there how you actually also have a background in theater. Did your experience in theater ever inspire you to try to create the games that you make, or has that played a role in how you approach designing these games?
Well, I think that early on, there was an overarching story for the Resistance. People didn't have enough interest for me to continue to maintain it, but I did a bunch of recordings that carried that story along, and it's still out there live somewhere in the world. And it was useful to have a background in theater to be able to do some of the voice acting and that kind of thing. I've always had an interest in writing, and although this is a very specific kind of writing, it was, fictionalizing. I don't have anything in any of the boxes that goes against something that has actually happened historically. But some of the boxes are fictionalized versions of what happened in order to make the game work. So I have made stuff up. And so that was really my background in writing, I think, that supported me there.
Okay. So you mentioned the Resistance, and there's three products of yours that you currently make: the Resistance, Craft, and Tower of the Four. Let's start with the Resistance. If you could explain how, so you mentioned that one used to have like an overarching story, but now is each month just like a self-contained story?
Yes, each month was always a self-contained story. And what happens is the overall premise is that we live in this dystopian future in which the government has been taking away more and more of our rights. And I swear this was fiction when I first wrote it. uh, and so corporations are having rights that used to belong to us, and the government has allowed them to start buying airspace over our homes, and like anything below a couple of feet below our houses, corporations can buy that as well. And so the premise is that we need to form a resistance, but it has to be secretive because we're worried about repercussions. And so we're training people to be effective resistance members. And each of the boxes is part of a resistance movement from history. So there's a box about the suffragettes, and there's a box about Gandhi, and there's a box about speakeasies. And so anytime that people were fighting back against an oppressor, there's a different lesson, And so the suffragettes box is about utilizing propaganda effectively. Right. And the speakeasy box is about, finding the safe people to talk to go get your drink on. And there's a box about the Italian Inquisition, which was a kinder, gentler Inquisition than the Spanish Inquisition.
Well, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, right?
Exactly. And that one is about hiding in plain sight. So, you're going to these balls and dancing, but you've got to figure out who the spy amongst you is. So there's different premises for each box and different lessons to learn about how to resist.
What inspired you to come up with the story of with the Resistance, with the idea of the dystopian future, and using historical events or time periods as the inspiration?
I started the business with a partner. I don't have one now. And we talked about what we were going to do. And our first thought was, absolutely, we do not want to do murder mysteries because there are so many out there. And we thought, what would a premise be that would have to do with trying to figure out these different puzzles? And so it occurred to us that if there was a resistance movement, you'd have to speak in code. And so it naturally flowed through. And part of that original box that she and I had worked on together, it was about a witch trial. And that's why we thought there was more, because we kept diving into the history of it. And so it was based on an actual witch trial, and then there was a complete fictional story around it. So we thought the model made sense, and we thought the idea of a resistance and having to speak in code lent itself very nicely to this kind of box.
And of course, being able to speak in code would be nice in today's world because, you have Siri and Alexa always listening in on you, right?
Exactly.
It's like there's a joke. It's like a friend asked me why I took down my Facebook account. Well, it's because I don't want Mark Zuckerberg knowing what I'm thinking all the time. I laughed. He laughed. Siri laughed. Alexa laughed. It was a good time.
It's funny because I do have a Google Home device. And sometimes just when I'm bored, it's in the kitchen. And when I'm bored, I sometimes just ask it really existential questions to see what it'll say.
Here's something fun to try. If you haven't done it already, ask it which is better, Star Wars or Star Trek.
Oh, okay. I'll have to do that.
Yeah, at least I've asked it to an Alexa before, and it gives actually a really cute answer. So
And I have asked what is the meaning of life, and it does in fact give the correct answer.
42,
Uh-huh.
outstanding.
Yep.
So the Resistance, so that one is again more of you said the dystopian future and uses history as a background. Now the next one this is one I'm a bit familiar with because I did get a few of these boxes, and that's The Craft, spelled Craaft. So what is craft short for?
The Center for Research and wait, you have to read it for me. I don't know.
Center for actually, I have one of the boxes sitting over here. Center for Research and Archives of Accident. No,
anecdotal
folktales. Yes.
Anecdotal folktales, right?
So yeah, definitely easier to just say craft.
Yes. So the premise there is that the director of the center, Lydia Lohr, is there are these things that happen out in the world. Like there was a research team that they had sent out to study some mysterious happenings that were happening on the US-Canadian border is one story. And the research team has disappeared. So it's your job to trace their steps and figure out what happened to them. So that's one. There are other boxes that are, we're digging through our archives and we need you to sort some of this stuff out and figure this out. And so the boxes on like curses and charms, those are a little more. This is research, but then a lot of them, there's one where you have to go to Japan and figure out a mystery in a manufacturing facility. And so all of them, as you're solving these different puzzles and trying to figure out what's happening in these different areas, that's what you're doing. So you're basically, hired on as a contractor.
Okay, so this organization here, it essentially investigates unusual occurrences.
Right.
And what was some of your inspiration for creating this particular series?
Well, when I was first doing my research on this, and this has been a passion. Folklore is a passion of mine, and it always has been. And so when I started to do the research, and this was back in 2018, I was just, trying to figure out what stories I wanted. And I stumbled across a podcast called the Folklore Podcast. And I just started binge listening to it. And there were, I think, 2.5 seasons out at that point. So I started listening, and I'd listen when I was doing my yard work or I was taking a walk. And I got some great ideas from that. And I was like, that's great. And I enjoyed listening to the podcast. So I continued on. And that was where I got a lot of my really good ideas. The rest of it was just online research and having an interest in the topic.
And I think I did recognize some of the stories you mentioned, like investigating the disappearance of a team along the Canadian border and the Japanese one, because I do have those boxes. And then I know there's one with Baba Yaga I have, and then one with a Tibetan one. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to look at those yet.
And another one just went out yesterday. So that one is set in Scotland.
Okay, that one should be fun.
Yeah.
So then the next one you have is called Tower of the Four.
Yes, and Tower of the Four was a collaboration with a friend of mine who is an author. And that is one of his series of books. And so basically we took the stories and used them to create the different boxes. Now, as opposed to the other two series that are both 12 box series, this is only a 6 box series. And it introduces you to each of the four main characters and it takes you through their origin stories, essentially. And so that was a very different exercise because in the first two series, it was a very iterative process. And the process, I'd build the puzzles and the story together and sort of go back and forth like what kind of puzzle fits right here, and in doing the research, like the one set in Japan, I learned a very interesting thing. Back hundreds of years ago, they had a game, and it was a card game, and it was called Headman, Hunter, Fox. It is essentially the precursor to rock, paper, scissors. The headman can tell the hunter what to do. So headman wins with hunter. The hunter can kill the fox, right? So hunter wins with fox, and the fox can outsmart the headman. And so finding appropriate games and puzzles and stuff to the era, first of all, I always try and get some of that in there. You can't 100% do it, but trying to find what would be appropriate. There's one that is about the Underground Railroad. And so there's a quilt puzzle in that because a lot of times quilts were used for particular messages. So always trying to find something that is appropriate to the storyline.
So Tower of the Four, that one is, you said, was a partnership with a friend. Now, was that one a limited series, or is that one still ongoing?
Well, that one is we're marketing it and trying to get the interest up. There is a potential for 6 more boxes, but we didn't want to move forward yet until we get it a little more firmly established. So it's on hiatus for now.
And what type of a theme does Tower of the Four have?
So it's set in a mystical world in which there are these people who are found as young adults, and they have supernatural powers, and they are taken to a school in which they're taught to use those powers, and they are formed into what is called a quad. And there are 4 people in every quad, and each of them has a different skill set. So one can read and understand people's emotions, and another can tap into people's thoughts. One is very physically has a great physical prowess, and the other one is connected to spirit. And so they need the others in order to break open what is called their soul blocks. And the soul blocks, once they're open, that's what allows them to utilize their power. So, and they have to bond almost as family in order to break open the soul blocks. And so the origin stories of each of them, basically there are these seekers that go out into the world, into the villages and the cities, and they find people that are going to be, join these quads. And then they have to agree, and they have to say, yes, I want to be it's called a quadrant. I want to be a quadrant. And then they hear this bell, and the next day someone comes to collect them and take them off to the school. And you hear the story of who they were before they knew that they were going to the school, and how the seeker finds them, and how they decide that yes, indeed, they do want to go, because they don't have to.
Tower of the Four has a fantasy theme. Craft has more of a folklore, almost like an urban fantasy type theme in a way. Resistance is more dystopian. Are there any other genres that you think you might want to explore in the future?
Well, I am in the middle of doing some research on female outlaws, women who behave badly, and their exploits. Because I think that that would be a whole lot of fun. Because there's a lot of really great stories throughout history of women who, going against expectations, or definitely even outlaws. And so it just sounds like fun.
Yeah, there's this bumper sticker I've seen every now and then. Well-behaved women rarely make history. So, but that sounds like it would be an interesting one. Because yeah, I mean, there's female pirates. I'm sure there were female outlaws in the Wild West, and back in England, I'm sure there were female highwaymen there as well.
Yeah, one of the boxes for the resistance, well, a couple of them are based on women, but one is based on a woman. Her name was Wang Congare, and she is the person that Mulan was roughly shaped after. And she's a fascinating woman. And that's kind of how I got interested in the topic in the first place. And she was a warrior. And it was definitely a very different origin story. She had been an acrobat and sort of a circus performer. And she was in a city, and she got somehow trapped in an alleyway with some guys who meant her mischief. And the man who eventually became her husband came in and rescued her and fought them both. And she was like, that was really cool. And so that it turns out that he was part of a resistance movement that was about the government and the taxes that they were imposing, which were very, very steep.
Yeah.
And so it was about, getting out into the villages and training these people to resist. And so she got caught up in the movement, and that's how she became a warrior.
Interesting. So yeah, it definitely sounds like that would be a fun series to develop.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about what goes into developing one of the boxes. So I have a few of the craft boxes, and it includes, the letter, it includes the story, the various puzzles, and usually a couple little fun trinkets or so. Like the first one I got, the Japanese one, had this just glittery, was it a Kasuni?
Kitsune.
And because I think I'd asked you this, like, do the trinkets that come in the boxes, are those just like more visual props, fun little extras, but do they ever actually have anything to do with the story itself?
Absolutely. There are a lot of things that I've custom ordered, like scarf. I ordered a scarf, and the custom design on it is a puzzle.
Oh, cool.
And then there's one, I don't want to give it away, but there's a candle that is included in a box, and it is needed to solve the box.
Interesting. How does the process go when you are deciding what to do for one of your puzzle boxes?
Well, I land on the story first and decide what I want it to be. And then I kind of sketch out the overall arc of the story and how that's going to go. And then, as I said earlier, it's a very iterative process. I'll start to write a piece of the story and then figure out, does this, is this best that you have to solve all of the puzzles and you get one major answer at the end, and everything ends up ultimately on a final payoff web page. Some of them walk you through a series of web pages, and you have to solve a puzzle to open that web page in order to be able to get to the next web page. And so I figure out how I want the physical process to go. And then when I start to write the puzzles, I see if they make sense. And I also work very hard to not have to have a variety of puzzles in every single box. And part of that is a varying degree of difficulty, because it's frustrating if you can't solve all of, any of the puzzles. And so there are some that are easier, and everybody's mind works in a different way. There is one of my puzzle testers is dyslexic. And he is, struggles with the word puzzles and the ciphers and things like that. But it's hilarious because when there's something that's more of a math kind of puzzle or imagery, he's always like, here's the answer. And everyone's like, how do you even? He's like, it's obvious. It's obvious. And so it just depends on how people think.
And that's a good point you make about how some people can solve certain types of puzzles in a snap, and then others, it's like, and I think I was mentioned this to you before when we were talking one time, how because I was coming up with a puzzle that I wanted to use for a demo adventure I made, and
Right.
since
Right.
I know you're really into puzzles, I sent it to you and like, okay, can you kind of give me a, just to see how long it would take you to solve it, because I wanted something that could be solved within a few minutes, not something that was going to take a long time. Because one of the challenges about introducing puzzles into role-playing games is, yeah, you can have what you think is going to be a really challenging, really complex, really well thought out puzzle, and you'll
Right.
have one player that'll figure it out just like that.
Yep.
And then sometimes I've encountered groups where I could present a puzzle to them that was from a book made for 6-year-olds, and they'll spend like 30 minutes overthinking it. So
That absolutely happens. And it's no fun if you're frustrated and stuck. So you never really want someone to get stuck. You want to make it challenging, but not over the top where they just, throw up their hands and say, ah. So what we do about that is there's a web page that you get a card in each box that says, here are where the hints are. And there's a series. So it'll be, a gentle hint, then there'll be a little more specific hint. And so you get a series of hints. And if you're still thinking, I have no idea what's going on, then there is here's how to solve it. And then you read it and say, you add up these numbers, and you tell them. And if they're like, fine, I don't want to deal with it, then there is the answer. So you can never get stuck with our boxes. And it's funny because you have the craft, and in the resistance, when we first started, I don't know why. I have no idea why I did this. I did all of the hints in rhyming couplets. And
and it just
it's like,
stuck.
yeah, it's the worst superpower ever, but I can make up a little rhyme for anything. And so I just started doing it. But then, when I got to the craft, there ended up being, because it's more fanciful than the resistance, the puzzles can be a little more whimsical. And I was just like, you know what? They don't need more of it here. Let's just give them the straightforward hints this time.
I have to say it is helpful that you do have the web page in there, because I'm one of those people where it's like, once, yes, I admit I've had to go to the web page many times, but it can be tricky sometimes because there's certain types of puzzles I am familiar with, but then there's others I'm not. So it is nice how you do have that hint there, so you can go in, and makes it a lot easier to figure it out. So you don't get frustrated and, toss the box across the room.
Right. And I think that too, you have to be careful deciding what messages are going to go with what kinds of puzzles, because messages like a cipher, that has a very aha moment. Like you crack the code in your brain. At that point, it's no fun to have to tediously go through 2 pages of actually translating the cipher back into English. And so those messages, cipher messages, need to be pretty short, because just the nature of it, the fun happens when you have the aha moment. And then you want it to quickly give you the message so you can move on. And you don't want to be doing homework, right? And so it just depends on what the message needs to be when I decide which kind of puzzle it'll be for that particular instance. And sometimes you need to bend things a little bit. and make some leaps of, why would this be a math puzzle right here? And so you have to figure out the reasoning for it and tell those stories. And I think that maybe the most fun I had with doing that, there is a book about Anansi, the spider god. And for that particular box, it wasn't a straight ahead story. There are lots of different stories about this particular god. And he's a trickster. And as a trickster, he gets into trouble all the time and he gets other people into trouble all the time. So there were lots of individual stories. So that was a lot of fun because I could put, instead of just one big story, I could put all of these different stories and marry up puzzles with the stories that worked really well.
So you do all this on your own. You write all the puzzles. Well, I know you mentioned Tower of the Four you worked on with a friend, but with Craft and Resistance, so you do everything on your own. You create the puzzles, you gather the images, you print it out, assemble the boxes. So yeah, it's impressive that you can do that on your own and do it on a consistent basis, because I imagine it must be tricky or stressful sometimes to be able to pump that out every month.
Yeah, I mean, early on, as I mentioned, I had a partner. She collaborated with me on 3 boxes. And so I did work with her on that. And then after that, I had spent the better part of a year developing the Resistance. And so before I even started selling. And so it wasn't that pressure to create. And then once I started selling the Resistance, and I had all of the boxes completed, I took about 6 months to develop the craft and get those going. So it's never really been to the point where I've been under the gun, like I've got to mail this out tomorrow and I don't know, So there's that. And then, of course, I have to create all the web pages and I do all the design work on that as well, which was a learning curve, but it's super easy for me to do now and it's pretty formulaic. So that's not that big of a deal. So I'm never doing it on a month to month basis. That would make me insane. And it's funny because I would probably be one of my own worst customers because as you do, I get frustrated and I'm like, I just want to solve this puzzle. I'm going to look at the hints. And I don't, I don't really like escape rooms because there's a time limit and it just stresses me out. I don't want to deal with it. It's no fun because it's like you have to get it done in an hour. And that's what I like about the boxes of, you can do it at your leisure. You can do part of a box and then come back to it later and it doesn't matter. So, and I know there are boxes out there that allow you to like log into their website and they give you a timer, which just, it's not fun. It's not fun at all.
Yeah, I prefer to do it at my own pace. It's like when I play video games, I've never really liked the video games with time limits just because, again, I don't like being rushed. So that's one thing I do like is that, yeah, you can work on it on your own pace. And if it takes you 2 or 3 days to solve a box, you can take your time.
Yeah, when I was a little kid, my dad was very into logic puzzles. And it's just one of my early memories that we used to solve logic puzzles together. And that was just such a comfortable, easy kind of activity because there was no, you solved it when you solved it and you're just hanging out having fun together. And so for me, that's what the fun part is. And I think I've done many, many boxes on my own, but I would consider that more research and figuring out what's working for people, what's not working. And the boxes have morphed over time into something different. The Resistance, because it's supposed to be anonymous, it is a plain cardboard box that comes and it has just the logo on the front and that's it. When I got to the craft, I was seeing lots of other boxes where people have a fully printed box. And so I commissioned an artist to create the creature that you see on the box, which I love that creature so much. And we, designed that piece. And then I worked with the company that makes my boxes to get that put onto, the box correctly. And so it's a very different feel. And I was in a very different place in designing. And because early on I was like, oh my God, because the boxes that are fully printed are, of course, much more expensive than the plain craft boxes. And by craft, I don't mean the craft, I mean the brown boxes, which are called craft boxes.
So earlier you mentioned that you were looking into making a series with a focus on women who misbehave or women who don't really follow stereotypical gender roles. Do you have plans to create any other new products in the future?
Oh, I haven't really thought about it. I do think that if I was going to do another series besides the one about the women, I would do a second season of The Resistance, because it is definitely the best seller and people like it a lot. And it appeals to a broader group of people. It really, the audience for, well, both the craft and the resistance is more of an intellectual crowd. And the people who they listen to history podcasts for fun because they like history, and people who listen to folklore podcasts for fun because they like folklore. And so it is a very, it's a broader appeal than just people that are into gaming. And that's nice to, have that availability. And so the resistance, I think, would be my top choice. I personally would probably prefer to write another season of The Craft because I love those stories so much, but I get my folklore fixes elsewhere, so I'm not going to worry about that.
And is there any way to get any of your past products right now? Or you mentioned seasons. Do you repeat it on a yearly basis?
Yes. So each of like I said, the craft and the resistance are both a 12-box series. So I'm not generating new ones at this point because I'm working on other projects. And so every December, the Speakeasy box comes out for the resistance. Every, October, the Baba Yaga box comes out for Halloween. And so trying to get those matched up kind of seasonally. But honestly, there is a schedule that you can go to on either of the websites that tells you what a synopsis of each story that comes out each month. And so if you say you got someone a present, you got them a 3-month subscription for Christmas last year. Well, you're not going to do that again because then you'll get the, December, January, February, and you've already gotten those. So if you want to get any off-season box, all you have to do is email, and that's completely fine.
And speaking of email, so where can people find you if they want to learn more about your games or if they want to contact you?
So you can go to madmenandheroes.com, and that will showcase all of the games, and you can purchase them there, or you can just email at madmenandheroes.gmail.com.
And I understand that you also have a podcast that you've been working on.
I do. The podcast is called Folkloring, and it is, at the time of this recording, debuting in the middle of next week, which is November 15th. And it is about folklore that you can take into action. So things from the past, from folklore, from the tales, and how you incorporate activities around that folklore into your day-to-day life. And I co-host that with Tanya Carwin, and she has a series of classes that are about folk crafting and creating, folk crafts, that is spinning and weaving and blacksmithing. And so the classes are teaching people how to do those things. And I am also writing a book on the history of magic and witchcraft, and looking at how the ideas have changed over time, and how people look at developing their own practice, whether they're a pagan or a Wiccan or just your general witch, I guess, and how and why people have done that over the past few centuries.
And I know you're also involved with another podcast called the Folklore Podcast.
I am the theater and film correspondent for the Folklore Podcast, and I also get all the storytellers. And so I interview a lot of directors, some writers, and we talk about how they develop their work. And that's been very interesting. We are also kicking off a podcast at the beginning of December called Stories from the Hearth. And it is a book at bedtime style podcast. And it is entirely read by listeners to the Folklore Podcast. And so it's been a lot of fun connecting with people. And at various levels, I've had a lot of professional storytellers come in. They record it themselves and send it to me, and it's easy. I put the intro and the outro and go with it. Sometimes I have people jump on a Zoom call with me, and I record it for them, and then I do the editing. And it's been great. And everyone is so lovely, and they just are excited about doing it. And we are definitely looking for more readers. So if anybody is interested, you can email me at folklorepodreaders@gmail.com.
It sounds good. Well, I'd like to thank you for joining us, Tracy. And as I said before, I did pick up some of the boxes. So any of the listeners, if you run games, whether it's Dungeons and Dragons or Call of Cthulhu or any game where you think that puzzles could play a part, certainly recommend picking up a couple of boxes, because there are some ideas in there that I might have to borrow for
feel free
some of the games I run. So thank you for joining us, Tracy. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we will talk to you next time. You have been listening to a presentation of Point of Insanity Game Studio. Visit us on the web at poigamestudio.com. Follow us on Twitter at POI Game Studio. Look us up on Facebook and email us at poigamestudio@gmail.com.